Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. We are so happy to have you with us today. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us to learn English and understand global events at the same time. Before we start, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from. We'd love to know your country and your thoughts about today's discussion.
Yes, we always enjoy reading your comments. They show how people from many different places think about international topics. Today's discussion is a very interesting one. We will talk about the relationship between the United States and Venezuela, a topic that combines politics, economics, and diplomacy. This story is not just about two countries, but about power, energy, and influence in our modern world.
That's right, Julia. The title of our episode is U.S.-Venezuela Relations, a New Era or Another Power Game. This question is important because it helps us think about how nations deal with each other. Is America really trying to start a new and better chapter with Venezuela? Or is this just another example of how powerful countries try to protect their own interests? We will explore both sides with clear and simple English.
Before we go deep, let's understand why this topic matters. The relationship between the US and Venezuela has been tense for many years. Venezuela is rich in oil, one of the most valuable natural resources in the world. The United States has long depended on oil imports, and that has made their connection both useful and complicated. So this relationship is not only political, but also economic and environmental.
Exactly. And for English learners like you, this topic gives a great chance to practice listening and expand your vocabulary. You will hear words like sanctions, diplomacy, energy exports, and strategic interests. These are real words used in international news, so by learning them here, you will understand the world better and sound more confident when you speak English.
That's a great point. Learning English through world topics is powerful because it connects language with real ideas. For example, when you read an English article about Venezuela or listen to a news report, you can recognize the words and expressions we use here. It's like learning English through real life, not just through a grammar book. And this way, your vocabulary becomes more meaningful.
So, before we continue, dear listeners, take a moment to comment below. Tell us, where are you listening from today? Are you from Asia, Africa, Latin America, or Europe? We always love to hear from you. And please share your opinion. Do you think the current U.S.-Venezuela relationship is moving toward a new beginning? Or do you feel it's another political power game? Your ideas make our community stronger.
Now let's set the background for everyone, especially those new to this topic. Venezuela is a country in South America, bordered by Colombia, Brazil, and Guyana. It faces the Caribbean Sea, which makes it a key player in regional trade and energy exports. The United States, of course, is one of the most powerful nations in the world, located far to the north. Despite the distance, these two countries have been tied together for decades through oil and politics.
Yes, and those ties have not always been friendly. Over the years, we have seen moments of cooperation and moments of great conflict. At times, the two countries traded heavily and had diplomatic agreements. But at other times, disagreements about leadership, human rights, and foreign influence caused tension. To understand the present, we must look at this long and complex history of ups and downs.
That's what we'll do throughout this podcast. Take you step by step from the early connections to the modern day. We'll look at how energy shaped their relationship, how international pressure and sanctions changed their paths, and whether recent talks might bring real progress. Along the way, we'll explain key English words and expressions so you can both learn about the topic and practice your English.
You know, Julia, sometimes when people hear international relations, they think it's too hard or too serious. But actually, these stories are very human. They are about how leaders make decisions, how ordinary people are affected, and how nations try to survive and grow. If you can understand one story like this in English, you can understand many others, because the ideas are similar across the world.
Yes, and that's why the English Globe was created, to make complex topics simple, friendly, and useful for learners. Every episode helps you build not only your English skills, but also your global awareness. So stay with us until the end, and you'll walk away with both knowledge and new vocabulary you can use in your daily conversations or studies.
So once again, dear listeners, please make sure you've liked this video, subscribed to the channel, and shared your thoughts below. We really appreciate your support. Together, we are building a global classroom where anyone, from any country, can learn English through stories that matter.
In the next part of our journey, we'll travel back in time to explore how this relationship between the United States and Venezuela began, from cooperation in the early years to conflict in the modern era. Understanding the past will help us see clearly what might happen next.
To really understand today's US-Venezuela relationship, we have to look back in time. History is like a map. It shows us how we arrived at the present. So, Julia, let's begin by talking about the early connections between the two countries. Many people may not know that Venezuela and the United States once had a friendly and cooperative relationship built mainly on trade, especially oil.
That's true, Adam. The relationship began to grow stronger during the early 20th century, when large American oil companies started exploring Venezuela's rich oil fields. At that time, Venezuela was one of the biggest oil producers in the world, and American companies wanted to invest there. The US saw Venezuela as a key partner in Latin America, and this created strong economic ties for many years.
In those early decades, oil was more than just energy. It was power, wealth, and influence. The U.S. supported Venezuela's oil industry and helped build its infrastructure. For Venezuela, this partnership brought technology, jobs, and revenue. But at the same time, it also made Venezuela's economy heavily dependent on oil exports and the global market, which meant that any political change or price shift could affect the entire nation.
Exactly. And that dependence on oil made the relationship complicated over time. In the mid-20th century, when global politics were changing rapidly, Venezuela began to experience social and political movements that wanted more control over their own natural resources. They didn't want foreign companies, even friendly ones, to control their national wealth. That idea slowly began to create distance between Venezuela and the United States.
Then came one of the most important moments in modern Venezuelan history: the rise of Hugo Chavez in the late 1990s. Chavez was a former soldier who came to power with a promise to give more control of the country's wealth to its people. He wanted Venezuela to be independent from foreign influence, especially from the United States. His political message was popular among many Venezuelans who felt left behind by globalization.
Chavez's leadership changed everything. He introduced what he called the Bolivarian Revolution, which focused on social programs, state control of oil, and resistance to what he saw as US interference. He spoke strongly against American foreign policy, and that caused major tension between Washington and Caracas. The United States criticized his government for limiting press freedom and political opposition, while Chavez accused the US of trying to control Latin America.
Yes, it became a real ideological battle. The U.S. stood for one model: capitalism, open markets, and private investment, while Venezuela under Chavez promoted socialism, state control, and independence from Western influence. For students listening to us, this is a great example of how global politics is not only about economics, but also about ideas and values. It shows how different worldviews can clash in diplomacy.
That's a good observation, Adam. The tension grew stronger in the early 2000s when Venezuela started building closer ties with countries like Russia, China, and Iran. This move worried the United States because those nations were often seen as rivals or competitors. So, while Venezuela was seeking to diversify its partnerships, the US viewed it as a challenge to its traditional influence in Latin America.
And it didn't stop there. The U.S. government responded by reducing cooperation and imposing targeted sanctions on certain Venezuelan officials, accusing them of corruption and undemocratic behavior. Venezuela, on the other hand, accused the U.S. of trying to destabilize its government. This back and forth created a deep mistrust that has lasted for more than 2 decades, shaping the way both countries see each other even today.
For English learners listening to us, notice the vocabulary we are using: sanctions, corruption, sovereignty, and influence. These words often appear in international news and are useful when talking about global politics. Sanctions mean official restrictions placed on a country or individuals. Sovereignty means the power of a country to make its own decisions without interference. These are key concepts in this story.
Good explanation, Julia. Now, after Hugo Chávez's death in 2013, Nicolás Maduro took over as Venezuela's president. Maduro promised to continue Chávez's policies, but the country soon entered a serious economic crisis. Inflation rose dramatically, jobs disappeared, and millions of Venezuelans began leaving the country to find better lives elsewhere. The United States and other countries blamed the government's mismanagement, while Venezuela blamed external pressure and sanctions.
That's right. And as the situation worsened, the relationship became even more difficult. The U.S. recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president in 2019, while Maduro remained in power with the support of the military and allies like Russia and China. This created a situation where two sides claimed legitimacy, and diplomacy became almost impossible. For a time, there were no formal relations at all.
Yes, it was one of the lowest points in U.S.-Venezuela relations. But it also showed how global politics often depends on interests, not emotions. The United States was defending what it saw as democratic principles, while Venezuela was defending what it saw as sovereignty and independence. Both sides believed they were right. For English learners, this is a good reminder that international conflicts are rarely simple. They have many layers.
Exactly. History teaches us that relationships between nations go through cycles. There are times of friendship, cooperation, and trade, and times of tension and disagreement. The same has been true for Venezuela and the United States. For almost a century, they have moved between partnership and confrontation depending on leadership, global energy markets, and political ideas. This is what makes their story so fascinating.
And when we think about the present, this long history helps us understand why both sides act carefully today. The past is never truly gone. It shapes the decisions of leaders, the expectations of citizens, and the strategies of diplomats. For our listeners, learning about this history in English is not just about vocabulary. It's about learning how to see cause and effect in international relations.
That's a very good point, Adam. Understanding the background gives us a stronger base to discuss modern issues. It's like learning English grammar. You can't build sentences correctly without knowing the basic rules. In the same way, we can't understand today's US-Venezuela situation without knowing how it all began, what went wrong, and why both sides now talk about starting over again.
So, dear listeners, we've now walked through more than 100 years of connection, from early oil cooperation to modern political confrontation. The story of US-Venezuela relations is one of hope, conflict, and change. In the next part of our journey, we'll move into the core of the story. What caused the greatest tensions, what role oil really played, and how sanctions became one of the most powerful tools in international politics. Now that we understand the long history between the United States and Venezuela, it's time to look at what really caused the tension. When we talk about US-Venezuela relations, one word always stands out: oil. It's almost impossible to talk about this relationship without talking about oil. It has shaped their trade, their politics, and even their foreign policies. But Julia, oil alone doesn't explain everything, does it?
No, not at all, Adam. Oil is at the center, but it's connected to many other forces: power, economy, and diplomacy. For decades, Venezuela was one of the largest oil suppliers to the United States. This gave Venezuela great importance, but it also made the country vulnerable to changes in global energy prices and to US influence. When oil prices were high, Venezuela had power. But when they dropped, the country suffered deeply.
Yes, and that economic dependence created frustration inside Venezuela. The government wanted to use its oil wealth for national development, but critics said corruption and poor management stopped real progress. When Hugo Chavez took power, he tried to nationalize the oil industry, meaning the government took control of it instead of foreign companies. His message was clear: Venezuelan oil should serve Venezuelan people, not outside corporations.
At first, that sounded like a strong and independent idea. Many Venezuelans supported it because they felt their country was finally standing up for itself. But the reality turned out to be more complex. When the state took over the industry, efficiency fell, production slowed, and corruption grew. The oil fields that once produced millions of barrels per day began to decline. This affected not only Venezuela's income, but also its relationship with the United States.
That's right. From the U.S. perspective, nationalization and anti-American speeches from Chavez looked like a direct challenge. The United States began to limit certain forms of cooperation and reduce imports. Later, as tensions rose, Washington imposed sanctions. For our English learners, let's explain that word again. Sanctions are official restrictions. For example, when one country decides to block trade or financial activities with another to push for political change.
Yes, and sanctions have been one of the most powerful tools the US has used against Venezuela. Over time, these sanctions became broader. They targeted government officials, state companies, and eventually the entire oil sector. The goal, according to US leaders, was to pressure Venezuela's government to hold fair elections and protect human rights. But from Venezuela's side, they saw sanctions as economic warfare that hurt ordinary citizens.
And that's where the story gets complicated. Both sides claim to be defending their principles. The U.S. says it is defending democracy, while Venezuela says it is defending sovereignty. But in the end, the people caught in the middle are the citizens. Sanctions can limit a government's resources, but they can also reduce food imports, medicine supplies, and jobs. For English learners, this is a great example of how international decisions have real effects on human lives.
Exactly. And diplomacy, the art of managing international relations, has played a key role here. Over the years, there have been moments when the two sides tried to talk again. In some years, US diplomats met with Venezuelan officials to find small areas of cooperation, like exchanging prisoners or allowing limited oil sales. But these moments of dialogue were fragile. A single disagreement could stop the process for months or even years.
That's true. And we can't forget the global dimension. The world energy market is always changing, and every time there's a crisis, for example, war or instability in another oil-producing country, Venezuela suddenly becomes important again. The U.S., always seeking stable energy sources, has had to balance its political disagreements with its practical energy needs. This balancing act is one of the reasons the relationship is full of contradictions.
Let's also look at the human side of diplomacy. There are ambassadors, negotiators, and international organizations that try to keep communication open. For instance, when direct US-Venezuela talks were frozen, other countries like Mexico or Norway stepped in to host peace dialogues. These talks didn't always lead to big changes, but they showed that diplomacy never fully dies. It just waits for the right time to return.
That's such an important point. In international politics, even when leaders criticize each other in public, diplomats often continue quiet discussions behind the scenes. They may not always agree, but they look for small openings where cooperation is possible. For example, during the global energy crisis, the U.S. allowed limited oil exports from Venezuela again. It wasn't a full friendship, but it was a practical step that showed how diplomacy adapts to reality.
Yes, and it also reminded people that no relationship is completely frozen forever. Even in times of conflict, there are areas where countries can find common interest. For Venezuela, selling oil means survival. For the US, it means stability in global energy prices. That's why, even after years of sanctions and angry speeches, there is still space for negotiation. Politics is full of surprises. One moment of crisis can lead to an unexpected handshake.
For our English learners, this section introduces a few important terms: diplomacy, negotiation, and sanction. Diplomacy means the official way countries talk to each other and solve problems without fighting. Negotiation means discussing a problem to find an agreement that both sides accept. And sanction, as we mentioned, means punishment or restriction to pressure a country to change its behavior. These are key words in global news and academic writing.
That's right. And if we think about it carefully, these three words, oil, sanctions, and diplomacy, are the engines that drive the US-Venezuela story. Oil brings them together, sanctions push them apart, and diplomacy tries to hold them in balance. Each of these forces pulls the relationship in a different direction, creating the complex situation we see today. It's not just a story of two countries, but a reflection of how power works in the world.
Yes, Julia. And I think it's also a valuable lesson for learners. When you study English through global topics like this, you are not only improving your listening and vocabulary, you are also building your understanding of how the world functions. Every news headline has a history behind it, and every decision has a reason. By reading, listening, and thinking in English, you begin to see connections that are invisible at first.
Well said, Adam. So far, we've seen how economic interests, political ideas, and diplomatic tools have shaped the US-Venezuela relationship. But the story doesn't end there. In recent years, we've seen new developments, changes in leadership, regional diplomacy, and even global energy politics. Some people say we are entering a new era of cooperation, while others believe it's just another version of the same power struggle.
That's right. And in our next part, we will take a closer look at those new developments. We'll explore what's been happening in the last few years. The easing of sanctions, the diplomatic talks, and the question that everyone keeps asking: is this really a new era, or just another political power game dressed in new words? Stay tuned, and let's continue to learn together through Global English.
In recent years, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela has shown a few signs of change. After years of high tension and strict sanctions, both sides have taken small but symbolic steps toward limited cooperation. For instance, the US government has eased some sanctions related to Venezuela's oil exports, allowing restricted trade in exchange for political and humanitarian commitments. This has given rise to cautious optimism among analysts and ordinary citizens who have long suffered from economic isolation and political deadlock.
That's interesting, Julia. But the question remains: do these moves represent a real change, or are they just another temporary phase in a long pattern of rivalry? For many observers, a thaw in relations suggests that both sides are willing to compromise, but others believe it could simply be a tactical pause. History shows that diplomacy often follows cycles of pressure and relief. Sometimes these gestures are made for short-term political advantage rather than a genuine desire to rebuild trust between the two nations.
You're absolutely right, Adam. It's important to look deeper at what's driving this apparent shift. The easing of sanctions wasn't a random act. It came after new negotiations related to global energy needs. When oil prices rose globally due to supply disruptions, Washington saw Venezuela as a potential source to stabilize the market. This economic factor created an incentive for dialogue. However, despite these practical motivations, both governments still face internal pressure. In Venezuela, political control remains a sensitive issue, while in the US, foreign policy toward Latin America continues to be debated.
Indeed, these internal factors are crucial to understanding whether we are witnessing a genuine improvement or simply a strategic calculation. Some American officials have spoken about encouraging democratic processes in Venezuela, but at the same time, they are cautious about giving too much ground. It's a delicate balance, supporting change while protecting national interests. On the Venezuelan side, leaders welcome any sign of relief from sanctions but are wary of losing political control or appearing dependent on foreign influence. This dynamic keeps the relationship fragile and uncertain.
That uncertainty is also reflected in the way both governments communicate. Publicly, they use careful and diplomatic language. There are no warm statements, but also no aggressive threats. It's a tone of cautious engagement. Behind closed doors, there might be technical discussions about oil production, humanitarian aid, or prisoner exchanges. But both sides are testing each other's sincerity. The global community, especially in Latin America and Europe, watches these talks closely, wondering if this could lead to long-term normalization or if it's just a short pause before tensions rise again.
If we call this period a thaw, it suggests that something cold is beginning to soften. Yet the question remains, will this warmth last? Real change requires more than symbolic gestures. It requires consistent dialogue, transparency, and a shared commitment to progress. Right now, the two countries are still standing on opposite sides of a long, frozen river, taking small steps toward each other, but not yet crossing. That image captures the current state of US-Venezuela relations, hopeful, cautious, and uncertain all at once.
And that's why this stage is so fascinating for English learners as well as global citizens. It teaches us how international politics often moves slowly, shaped by economic realities and human emotions. The world tends to look for dramatic breakthroughs, but sometimes the most meaningful changes begin with quiet conversations and small steps. Whether this is truly a new era or just another chapter in a continuing power game will depend on how both sides act in the coming months and how sincerely they want to end decades of distrust.
When we talk about the relationship between the United States and Venezuela, we can't ignore the wider picture. The international scene plays a massive role in shaping how both countries act. So, Julia, how do other global powers factor into this relationship? It's not just about two nations arguing or negotiating. It's about a complex web of interests that includes countries like Russia and China, as well as regional organizations across Latin America. These external players influence everything from trade and diplomacy to military strategy and public perception.
Exactly, Adam. Venezuela's alliances with Russia and China have become essential to its survival during years of sanctions and political isolation. When the US cut most of its economic ties, Venezuela turned eastward, seeking new partners who could offer investment, loans, and technology. China became one of its biggest lenders, financing infrastructure and oil projects. Russia, on the other hand, provided military cooperation and political support at international forums. These partnerships gave Venezuela breathing space, helping it resist US pressure while projecting an image of independence from Western dominance.
That makes a lot of sense, Julia. From the American perspective, these alliances are viewed as strategic challenges. The U.S. sees Russia and China's presence in Latin America as part of a global contest for influence. In Washington, many officials argue that when rival powers strengthen ties with countries in the Western Hemisphere, it could weaken the U.S.'s traditional role in the region. That's why the relationship with Venezuela isn't only about human rights or democracy, it's also about competition for power, access to natural resources, and geopolitical influence in what has long been considered America's neighborhood.
And what's interesting is that Venezuela has used this situation to its advantage. By aligning itself with Russia and China, it has been able to play what we might call a balancing game. It signals to Washington that it has options. When the US increases sanctions or criticism, Caracas deepens ties with Moscow and Beijing. When there's a hint of negotiation with the US, Venezuela can use its other alliances as leverage. This type of diplomacy is common among smaller states facing pressure from stronger powers. They seek to balance relationships to maintain autonomy and bargaining strength.
That's a clever strategy, but it also comes with risks. Aligning too closely with one side can make a country dependent on that partner's agenda. For example, heavy borrowing from China created long-term debt obligations for Venezuela, and repayment is often linked to oil exports. If global prices drop or production falls, the economic burden grows. Similarly, Russia's support gives Venezuela political protection at the United Nations, but it also ties the country to Moscow's global conflicts and priorities. So, while these alliances bring short-term benefits, they can also reduce Venezuela's flexibility in the long run.
Absolutely, Adam. We can't forget the regional dimension either. Latin America is not a passive observer in this power game. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia each have their own views on the situation. Some prefer to maintain neutrality and focus on trade, while others take clear political positions. Regional organizations such as the Organization of American States, OAS, and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, often reflect these divisions. They discuss issues like human rights, migration, and sanctions, showing how Venezuela's domestic policies ripple across the hemisphere.
Yes, those ripple effects are important. Millions of Venezuelans have migrated to neighboring countries over the past decade, putting pressure on economies and social systems. This humanitarian aspect often brings external powers into play as well, because aid, funding, and policy coordination involve multiple actors. For instance, European countries have provided humanitarian assistance, while the United Nations has coordinated relief efforts. So, even beyond politics, the crisis has become a truly international issue, linking Venezuela not only with Russia and China, but with an entire network of global partners.
That's a great point, Adam. The involvement of these countries shows how interconnected modern diplomacy has become. It's not simply a matter of one country versus another. When the US enforces sanctions, China steps in to invest. When Russia faces its own global tensions, it may use its alliance with Venezuela as a signal of its influence in the Western Hemisphere. In this sense, Venezuela becomes a stage where larger powers test their global strategies, and each move in this complex chess game affects millions of ordinary people, both inside and outside the country.
And for the United States, maintaining influence in Latin America has always been a strategic priority. Since the early 19th century, Washington has viewed the region as vital to its security and prosperity. But in today's world, that influence is no longer guaranteed. China has become Latin America's largest trading partner in several sectors, and Russia's media and defense activities are expanding. So, when the US looks at Venezuela, it doesn't only see a country in crisis, it sees a potential entry point for rivals to expand their power close to home. That's why the issue feels so urgent.
Indeed, and this global context explains why even small diplomatic gestures between the US and Venezuela carry big meaning. If the two countries move toward cooperation, it could reduce the influence of external powers. But if they move further apart, Russia and China will likely strengthen their presence even more. The future balance depends on how flexible each side is willing to be. Both Washington and Caracas must consider not only their domestic audiences, but also how their choices will shape their standing in a world that is increasingly multipolar and competitive.
In a way, Venezuela has become a testing ground for global power dynamics. It shows how modern international relations are rarely black and white. Every decision has layers of economic, political, and strategic meaning. For English learners, this topic offers rich vocabulary. Words like alliance, leverage, sanctions, geopolitics, and hemisphere. It also helps us see how language and global awareness are linked. Understanding these connections gives us insight into how nations communicate, compete, and cooperate in an era where power is no longer held by just one or two superpowers.
That's a thoughtful way to put it, Adam. Whether Venezuela's ties with Russia and China lead to stability or further division will depend on the choices its leaders make and how the United States responds. The hemisphere is watching closely, and every action has consequences. As English learners and global citizens, understanding these relationships helps us not only improve our vocabulary, but also see how the world around us is shaped by politics, economics, and diplomacy. The story of US-Venezuela relations is, in many ways, a story of global power itself, shifting, uncertain, and deeply interconnected. When we talk about politics and power, it's easy to forget that behind every policy, there are real people whose lives are affected every single day. The story of Venezuela over the past decade is not just about governments and diplomacy. It's about millions of ordinary citizens who have faced one of the largest migration crises in the modern world. Since the economy collapsed and political tensions deepened, more than 7 million Venezuelans have left their country in search of food, medicine, and stability. Many walked across borders with almost nothing, hoping to rebuild their lives elsewhere in South America.
That's a staggering number, Julia. It's difficult to imagine the scale of that movement. I've read that countries like Colombia, Peru, and Brazil have taken in millions of Venezuelans, while others have moved further north, some even trying to reach the United States. This isn't just a political challenge, it's a human one. Every migrant represents a family, a dream, and often a painful separation from home. But I wonder, how exactly does this humanitarian and migration crisis link back to the United States? How does it influence U.S. policy or affect the relationship between the two nations in a deeper way?
It connects in several ways, Adam. First, migration is now part of the global conversation on stability and security. The United States, as a regional power, cannot ignore such a massive humanitarian situation unfolding in its hemisphere. Over the past few years, Washington has provided billions of dollars in humanitarian aid to support neighboring countries hosting Venezuelan refugees. It has also debated its own immigration policies, whether to accept more asylum seekers or to tighten border controls. So even if the crisis starts in Venezuela, its effects reach across borders and influence U.S. domestic politics and international image.
That's true, and it also highlights how deeply connected our modern world has become. Economic decisions in one country can ripple across continents. When Venezuela's oil industry declined, its economy almost collapsed, leading to shortages of basic goods, inflation, and unemployment. People who couldn't afford food or medicine had no choice but to leave. The United States, once one of Venezuela's biggest oil customers, suddenly had to rethink its energy partnerships. So, a humanitarian crisis quickly turns into an economic and strategic issue, one that touches both sides of the relationship in unexpected ways.
Yes, and the economic consequences are still unfolding. Inside Venezuela, years of hyperinflation destroyed savings and salaries. Many skilled professionals, teachers, doctors, and engineers left the country, creating what experts call a brain drain. This loss of human talent makes recovery even harder. For neighboring nations, the sudden arrival of millions of migrants creates both opportunities and challenges. Some economies benefit from new workers, while others struggle with limited resources. The balance between compassion and capacity becomes a delicate issue, and that's where international cooperation becomes essential.
It's also worth mentioning that humanitarian challenges often influence public opinion, both in the U.S. and across Latin America. When people see images of migration or hear stories of families separated, they begin to question how governments handle such situations. In the United States, opinions are divided. Some call for stronger action to promote democracy and human rights in Venezuela, while others argue that sanctions have made life worse for ordinary citizens. That tension between moral responsibility and political strategy lies at the heart of many foreign policy debates.
Exactly, Adam. And for English learners listening today, this topic is not just about facts. It's about empathy and understanding. Learning English also means learning the language of humanity. When we read or listen to international news, we should remember that behind every headline, there are people who speak, cry, and hope just like us. By studying these stories, learners can practice words like migration, refugee, sanction, humanitarian aid, and crisis. But they can also reflect on how global issues connect us as human beings beyond borders and politics.
That's such an important message, Julia. The humanitarian and economic spill effects show that foreign policy isn't something distant or abstract. It affects families, communities, and even classrooms. When Venezuelan children move to new countries, they need schools, language lessons, and support to adapt. Many begin learning English to access better opportunities. So, in a way, this crisis indirectly increases English learning across the region, as people search for work, education, and stability in a globalized world where English remains a bridge language.
And that bridge is what makes this topic so meaningful for our listeners. By understanding the human side of US-Venezuela relations, you're not just studying international affairs, you're also seeing how language, migration, and empathy connect across cultures. When we look at the crisis from this angle, we can see that diplomacy isn't only about power or resources. It's also about how nations and individuals respond to suffering, support human dignity, and build a future based on cooperation rather than confrontation. That's a powerful lesson for every English learner and every global citizen.
Yes, and it reminds us that learning about global issues like this one can shape how we use language to express compassion, awareness, and responsibility. Whether you're reading English articles, writing essays, or joining discussions online, these topics give meaning to your words. Understanding the humanitarian side of the US-Venezuela relationship isn't just about knowing the facts. It's about finding your voice as an informed learner who can speak thoughtfully about the world. That, in the end, is what makes studying English a truly global and human experience. Now, dear listeners, let's take a short break from the political side of our discussion and focus on what this podcast is really designed for, helping you learn English through real and meaningful global topics. We've talked about sanctions, diplomacy, migration, and alliances, but today, we want to make sure you truly understand some of the key vocabulary and expressions we've been using so far. Remember, learning English isn't just about memorizing words, it's about understanding how they are used in context and how they connect to real situations in the world around you.
That's right, Adam. When we listen to political or international news, many words repeat again and again, and learning them helps you understand not only English, but also the ideas behind it. Let's start with one of the most important words in our podcast, sanction. The word sanction means an official punishment or restriction that one country puts on another to change its behavior. For example, the United States placed sanctions on Venezuela to pressure its government to make political reforms. Can you say that word with me? Sanction. Excellent. It's a very useful word when talking about politics and economics.
Yes, and notice how it can be both a noun and a verb. You can say, the U.S. imposed sanctions, or the U.S. sanctioned a company. It's one of those flexible English words that changes meaning slightly depending on how you use it. Now, another key phrase we've used a few times is diplomatic recognition. This refers to the official acceptance of one government by another as legitimate. For instance, the U.S. restored diplomatic recognition with Venezuela after years of tension. When you hear that phrase, Think of countries agreeing to talk again through embassies or official channels.
A related term is diplomacy. It's a beautiful word, and it means managing international relations through discussion rather than conflict. In simple terms, diplomacy is about talking instead of fighting. For example, the leaders used diplomacy to solve their differences. It's one of those words that can be used in both global and personal contexts. You can even use it in daily life, like, she spoke with great diplomacy during the meeting. This helps you see how global language can apply to your everyday conversations too.
Very true, Julia. Another expression we've discussed is energy export. This means selling natural resources like oil or gas to other countries. Venezuela, for example, depends heavily on its energy exports to support its economy. So you can say, oil exports are a major source of income for Venezuela. Words like export and import are fundamental in English when talking about trade. To help you remember, export means to send goods out, while import means to bring goods in. Try repeating this. Venezuela exports oil, and the U.S. imports technology.
Good. Another important term is geopolitical rival. This might sound complex, but let's break it down. Geo means earth or world, political refers to power or governance, and rival means a competitor. So, geopolitical rival means a country that competes with another for power or influence around the world. For example, the US sees China as a geopolitical rival in Latin America. This is a common phrase in international relations, and you'll often hear it in English news or analysis. When you say it, try to speak slowly. Geopolitical rival.
Excellent explanation, Julia. Now let's move on to another useful word we've heard in this podcast, alliance. This word describes an agreement between countries or groups that decide to support each other. For example, Venezuela formed an alliance with Russia and China. You can also use it in other contexts, like the two companies created an alliance to develop new technology. So remember, alliance means partnership for a shared purpose, whether political, economic, or social.
Another expression that appeared often is foreign policy. This refers to the way a country deals with other nations. You can think of it as a country's strategy for managing its relationships. For example, the US foreign policy toward Latin America has changed over time. It's a simple phrase, but it represents a big idea. Whenever you hear foreign policy, imagine decisions, goals, and actions that a government uses when dealing with the rest of the world.
Right? And connected to that is the term regional influence. This means the power or impact a country has in its surrounding area. For example, the U.S. has strong regional influence in the Western Hemisphere. This phrase is helpful because it can be applied in many areas. A company can have regional influence in business, and a country can have it in politics. When you use phrases like these, you're learning how to describe power, relationships, and reach, concepts that are very important in global discussions.
Let's also review the word crisis. We've used it several times when discussing Venezuela's situation. A crisis is a serious problem that needs immediate action. For instance, Venezuela is facing an economic crisis. The word can describe many situations: a health crisis, a political crisis, or even a personal crisis. It's a very common English word, so it's good to understand it well and practice using it in different contexts.
Finally, one more important expression for today is humanitarian aid. It refers to help given to people in need, usually during a crisis. For example, the United States sent humanitarian aid to support Venezuelan refugees. This phrase often appears in news about disasters or conflicts. It represents kindness and global cooperation, which are also beautiful parts of the English language.
So, dear listeners, as you reflect on these words, sanction, diplomacy, alliance, geopolitical rival, humanitarian aid, and more, try repeating them aloud. Then, think of one example sentence you can make for each. You can even pause this podcast, write them down, and practice saying them slowly and clearly. The more you use them, the more natural they will feel in your speech.
Exactly. Vocabulary isn't just something to remember, it's something to live with. The more you listen, read, and speak these words, the more you'll understand how English connects to the real world. Each term you learn brings you closer to global conversations. And that's what the English Globe is all about, helping you build your language skills while exploring the world's most important stories. Keep practicing, stay curious, and remember that every new word is a small step toward a bigger understanding of both language and life. Let's explore some possible scenarios in US-Venezuela relations. Thinking about what if helps us understand the future while also practicing English. The first scenario is that relations could improve significantly. If the US and Venezuela decide to cooperate more, then we might see a reduction in sanctions, more trade, and political dialogue that actually works. This could allow Venezuela to recover economically, giving citizens access to food, medicine, and jobs, and it could strengthen regional stability across Latin America.
Yes, Adam. If this first scenario happens, then the United States might see new opportunities for trade and influence in the region without conflict. Latin American countries could benefit from more stable borders and better economic integration. And for English learners listening today, you could use conditional sentences like this. If relations improve, then migration pressures might decrease. It's a simple grammar structure that shows cause and effect clearly while connecting to real-world events.
The second scenario is that rivalry continues. If both countries remain suspicious and competitive, then sanctions will likely stay, and diplomatic progress could stall. Venezuela might continue to rely on allies like Russia and China, increasing their influence in the region. Latin America would experience ongoing uncertainty, and migration flows could remain high. Citizens might continue facing economic and humanitarian challenges, and global markets may react to instability in oil exports and political unrest.
Exactly, Adam. And using English, we can describe this scenario with conditional sentences. For example, if sanctions continue, then economic recovery will be slow. Or, if tensions rise, then migration could increase. These phrases allow learners to connect grammar with global events, making both language and knowledge stronger. We are showing how English can explain complex international situations step by step.
The third scenario is something in between, partial cooperation with continuing tensions. If limited agreements happen, then both sides might find small areas to work together, like energy trade or humanitarian aid, but underlying distrust could remain. Venezuela may slowly improve its economy, but political problems could continue. The U.S. might gain some influence, yet must remain cautious. Latin America would see small improvements but still face challenges. This is often the most realistic scenario because global relationships rarely change overnight.
Yes, Adam. And learners can practice conditional language here as well. If there is partial cooperation, then some progress is possible, but problems may continue. You see how we use if, then, to show cause and effect. This is one of the most important structures in English, and by linking it to real-world events, it becomes easier to remember. You can even create your own sentences. If Venezuela improves its economy, then citizens will have better living conditions.
So these scenarios, improved relations, continued rivalry, or partial cooperation, help us think critically about the future while practicing English. If we imagine these possibilities, then we can understand consequences for politics, economics, and human life. Using conditional language connects grammar with meaning, making your English learning both practical and engaging.
Exactly, Adam. And listeners, try making your own what-if sentences. For example, if the US and Venezuela cooperate, then migration might decrease. Or, if tensions remain, then Latin America may face economic instability. By practicing this, you not only improve your grammar, but you also gain insight into international relations. Thinking in what-if scenarios is a powerful tool for both learning English and understanding the world.
Remember, Julia, the goal is not just to know what could happen, but also to communicate it clearly in English. Conditional sentences, combined with vocabulary like sanctions, diplomacy, migration, and cooperation, allow learners to speak and write about complex ideas in a simple, understandable way. This practice makes English learning meaningful because it's tied to real-world knowledge and critical thinking skills.
Yes, Adam. So, dear listeners, reflect on these scenarios and try to make your own sentences using if, then, with the new vocabulary we've learned. By connecting English grammar to world events, you strengthen both your language skills and your global awareness. It's a win-win for every learner who wants to speak confidently about important international topics. Dear listeners, now let's talk about why today's topic is important for you as an English learner. Understanding international relations, like the situation between the US and Venezuela, does more than help you follow the news. It improves your English, your global awareness, and your critical thinking skills all at once. When you listen to these discussions, you are exposed to real vocabulary, phrases, and sentence structures used in everyday global communication. You also learn to connect ideas, understand cause and effect, and think about consequences, which strengthens your reasoning in English and in life.
Exactly, Julia. And there are practical ways you can turn this knowledge into English practice. For example, try reading English medium news articles about US-Venezuela relations or related topics. As you read, underline new words or phrases and look up their meanings. Then, write short summaries of what you learned. Even a few sentences each day will help you remember vocabulary like sanctions, diplomacy, migration, and geopolitical rival. Writing in your own words reinforces understanding and helps you think critically about the events, which is just as important as learning grammar.
Another tip, Adam, is to discuss these topics with a friend or online study group. Speaking about real-world issues gives context to the words you learn. You can ask questions like, what do you think will happen if relations improve? Or, how might migration change with new policies? Practicing this way trains you to form opinions and explain them clearly in English. It also makes learning dynamic and interactive, rather than memorizing words without understanding their meaning.
Absolutely. And remember, learning English isn't only about grammar or vocabulary. It's also about connecting with the world around you. When you understand the global stage, like international diplomacy, energy trade, or humanitarian crises, you can use your English to describe these events, express your opinions, and engage in meaningful conversations. This is the kind of learning that goes beyond the classroom and helps you communicate confidently with people worldwide.
Yes, Adam. And for our listeners, think of English as a bridge. It connects you to ideas, cultures, and global issues. By following topics like US-Venezuela relations, you improve your reading, writing, listening, and speaking skills. You also gain a deeper understanding of the world, which helps you make informed decisions, participate in discussions, and even prepare for exams like IELTS or TOEFL. Learning English becomes a tool for both language and knowledge.
So, dear learners, make this part of your daily routine. Read news in English, write your reflections, discuss with friends, and repeat the new vocabulary we practiced today. By combining language learning with awareness of global issues, you strengthen both your English and your ability to think critically. You become not only a better speaker, but also a more informed global citizen.
Exactly. Every word you learn, every sentence you form, and every discussion you have about world events makes your English more meaningful. It's about understanding, connecting, and communicating. When you follow international topics thoughtfully, you're not just studying English, you're learning how to engage with the world. And that, dear listeners, is why topics like US-Venezuela relations matter to you as an English learner. Dear listeners, as we move into this final and very important section, we want you to reflect deeply on everything we have covered today. Understanding the US-Venezuela relationship is not just about knowing political facts or memorizing historical events. It is about seeing the world as a learner who connects language, critical thinking, and global awareness. By exploring diplomacy, sanctions, migration, alliances, and economic consequences, you have been exposed to real-world English that is used in newspapers, debates, and international forums. This exposure is essential for learners because language is not only a tool for communication, it is also a tool for understanding ideas, analyzing situations, and thinking logically about global affairs. When you reflect on these topics, you practice not only your English listening and comprehension, but also your ability to think clearly and explain complex ideas in a simple, organized way.
That's a very good point, Julia. Reflection is one of the most powerful techniques in long-term learning. When you pause to consider what you have learned about sanctions, diplomatic recognition, energy exports, geopolitical rivals, alliances, and humanitarian crises, you begin to see patterns in global events. For example, when countries impose sanctions, they often intend to change behavior, but these decisions can also create unintended economic and human consequences. By connecting the vocabulary we learned to real-life consequences, learners start to understand both the language and the logic of international relations. Conditional sentences like, if relations improve, then migration may decrease, become not only grammar practice, but also a way to analyze the world systematically.
Exactly, Adam. And the human side of the story is equally important. Millions of Venezuelans have migrated to neighboring countries, and millions of families face difficult choices every day. Understanding this human impact allows learners to connect emotionally while practicing English. For instance, you might write, if humanitarian aid reaches communities quickly, then lives can improve. Or, if economic reforms fail, then migration will continue. These exercises strengthen grammar skills, vocabulary, and the ability to express cause and effect. They also help you reflect on global responsibility and empathy, showing how language connects to real experiences.
Another long-term strategy is reading in English regularly. Following reputable news sources, opinion pieces, or even blogs about international relations will allow you to see vocabulary in context repeatedly. Words like sanction, diplomacy, alliance, and geopolitical rival appear often in articles about conflicts, negotiations, and global power dynamics. Try to underline these words when you read, look up their precise meanings, and then use them in sentences or summaries. Writing short reflections after reading not only reinforces vocabulary, but also trains you to think critically and summarize complex information clearly in English, which is an essential skill for advanced learners.
Yes, and speaking practice is equally important. If possible, discuss these topics with a friend, study partner, or even online group. Speaking allows you to use vocabulary and grammar in real time. For instance, you can debate questions like, if US-Venezuela relations improve, how will the migration crisis be affected? Or, what role do Russia and China play in Venezuela's economy? By discussing these topics, you not only practice English fluency, but also learn to articulate opinions and support them with examples, which is an important skill for both academic and everyday communication.
It's also valuable to combine multiple skills at once. For example, after reading an article about Venezuela's economy or recent diplomatic talks, you can write a summary, underline key vocabulary, and then discuss your summary with a partner or record yourself speaking. This multi-layered approach, reading, writing, and speaking, reinforces memory and comprehension. For English learners, integrating content and language in this way is far more effective than memorizing isolated words. You begin to understand how ideas are structured, how arguments are built, and how language expresses cause, consequence, and comparison.
Yes, Adam. And we also encourage you to use reflective exercises to connect this knowledge to your personal learning journey. For instance, after listening to this podcast, ask yourself, which scenario seems most likely for US-Venezuela relations, and why? Write a paragraph answering this question using words and expressions we introduced today. Sentences like, if cooperation increases, then migration might decrease. Or, if rivalry continues, then humanitarian pressures may grow, allow you to apply both vocabulary and grammar. Reflection helps your mind retain information longer because you are actively connecting English learning with critical thinking about real-world events.
Furthermore, thinking about global issues in English gives you a unique advantage. When you discuss international politics, migration, and economics in English, you are practicing the language in meaningful contexts. You're not just learning vocabulary, you're learning how to use language to describe complex situations, explain cause and effect, and evaluate possible outcomes. This skill is valuable not only for English exams, but also for professional and academic growth. Global awareness becomes intertwined with language ability, which makes learning more engaging and practical.
And remember, English is not just a language to read or write, it is a way to engage with the world. By reflecting on international events like the dynamic between the United States and Venezuela, you train yourself to understand multiple perspectives, consider consequences, and explain your reasoning in clear English. You learn expressions like if, then, as a result of, and this means that, which are crucial for formal writing, presentations, and even casual discussions about world affairs. These expressions are the building blocks for critical thinking in English.
Exactly, Julia. We also want to remind listeners that progress comes from consistency. Review vocabulary regularly, practice writing short paragraphs about current events, speak with others in English whenever possible, and use the new phrases you learn in your daily life. By connecting your English practice with meaningful topics, your skills improve faster because your mind is actively associating words with ideas, not just memorizing them. Over time, this approach will help you not only master grammar and vocabulary, but also gain confidence in expressing complex ideas clearly.
Finally, we encourage you to make reflection a habit. After each podcast or lesson, take a few minutes to summarize what you learned, highlight key words, and think about how this knowledge applies to your own life or to the wider world. For instance, reflecting on migration, sanctions, or alliances helps you see the human and political dimensions of events while reinforcing language skills. This combination of learning and reflection ensures that your English grows steadily and your understanding of global issues deepens, giving you the tools to communicate thoughtfully in both English and your own worldview.
So, dear listeners, remember this: every sentence you form, every word you practice, and every reflection you write brings you closer to fluency while giving you a global perspective. English is not just a subject, it's a key to understanding and participating in the world. Keep practicing vocabulary, writing summaries, speaking your thoughts, and reflecting on lessons like today's. By doing so, you transform your English learning into a meaningful journey that connects language with knowledge, awareness, and critical thinking.
Yes, Adam. And remember, your journey does not end here. Each episode is an opportunity to explore new ideas, practice new words, and connect with global issues. Take the time to review this podcast, complete the tasks, and share your thoughts in writing or speaking. English becomes powerful when it is used to think, analyze, and communicate about real-world topics. By applying what you've learned today, you are not only improving your language skills, but also shaping yourself as a more informed, thoughtful, and globally aware learner.
Thank you for joining us for this extended reflection. Keep exploring, keep practicing, And remember that every word you learn and every idea you consider brings you closer to mastering English and understanding the world around you. Use today's vocabulary, practice your conditional sentences, and think critically about global relations. This is how English learning becomes a lifelong skill and a window to the world, empowering you to communicate effectively and participate fully in conversations about real issues.
Exactly, Adam. And with that, we conclude today's podcast. Keep reflecting, keep writing, and keep speaking English in meaningful ways. Let this reflection guide your next steps, help you deepen your vocabulary, and strengthen your understanding of both language and the world. Every thought, every sentence, and every paragraph you practice today will make your English stronger and your global perspective sharper.
As we conclude today's podcast, let's quickly summarize the key points we explored about U.S.-Venezuela relations. We discussed the long history of tension, including sanctions, political conflicts, and periods of limited engagement. We examined recent developments, like partial easing of sanctions and diplomatic talks, and asked whether these moves signal a new era or are just superficial gestures. We also looked at the role of external powers, Russia, China, and regional actors, and how they influence the balance of power in Latin America.
We didn't stop there, Adam. We also explored the human side of this relationship, including the economic challenges, migration, and humanitarian impacts on ordinary people. We highlighted vocabulary that helps learners describe these topics, such as sanction, alliance, geopolitical rival, humanitarian aid, and energy export. Then, we imagined possible scenarios: full cooperation, continued rivalry, or something in between, using conditional sentences to show cause and effect. Finally, we explained why this topic matters to you as a learner, connecting English skills with global awareness and critical thinking.
Exactly, Julia. And now it's time for a learning task to help you practice English in a meaningful way. We encourage you to write a short paragraph in English expressing your opinion on what you think is more likely. Will U.S.-Venezuela relations enter a new era of cooperation, or will they continue as a power game? Be sure to use some of the vocabulary we introduced today, such as sanction, diplomacy, alliance, or geopolitical rival. Writing this paragraph will help you not only review words, but also practice forming sentences, expressing ideas, and thinking critically about world events.
Yes, and when you write, try to use conditional sentences like, if relations improve, then, or, if tensions continue, then. This helps you practice English grammar while reflecting on real-world situations. Take your time to organize your thoughts clearly, and don't worry about making mistakes. Writing regularly will gradually improve your confidence and fluency. This is also a chance to connect English learning with understanding global issues, which makes your practice much more interesting and useful.
Before we finish, I want to remind our listeners to review the vocabulary section again. Repetition is key to remembering words and phrases, and linking them to current events makes them easier to recall. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to the English Globe for more content that combines language learning with global knowledge. Reflect on what you learned today and think about how understanding international relations can make your English more meaningful and your perspective on the world sharper.
Exactly. Learning English is not just about grammar or vocabulary, it's about connecting with ideas, cultures, and global events. By studying topics like U.S.-Venezuela relations, you strengthen your language skills while becoming more aware of the world around you. So, take this task seriously, practice your writing, review the new words, and use them in sentences. This is how English becomes not just a language you speak, but a tool for thinking, learning, and engaging with the world.
Thank you for listening today. Keep practicing, stay curious, and remember that every word you learn and every idea you explore brings you closer to mastering English and understanding our interconnected world. See you in the next episode, and don't forget to share your paragraph in the comments or with a friend. Using English in context is the best way to grow.
Yes, keep reflecting, writing, and speaking. Your English journey becomes stronger every time you connect language to real-life topics. We hope today's discussion inspires you to continue exploring global issues while building your confidence and skills in English.